right. Hello. For the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to focus mostly on United States BIMO audits, but I believe the approach is about the same regardless of the agency that we're talking about. So I'll also try to sprinkle in a little bit of my own insight from my own personal experience with an FDA inspection, but please bear with me because I decided to try to fit a lot of information into a short amount of time. As a little background information, I was hired as a research coordinator originally for the Sims-Murphy Foundation in Memphis, Tennessee, and I was hired because the current coordinator was struggling and the study needed a little help, and we knew that they were going to have an audit because the PI was the highest enroller. So this particular study, we had our FDA inspection in January of 2018, and after all of our hard work and about the steps that I'll cover here shortly, we ended on a positive note with no formal sanctions issued. Okay. So I have no financial interests to disclose. So let's start with just a little background information on BIMO audits in case you haven't been through one yourself. The FDA Biomedical Monitoring Program protects the rights and safety of human research subjects. It validates the data quality, and it does so while enforcing FDA regulations. In terms of the types of inspections you could undergo, you could have your routine inspection or your for-cause inspection. So routine is going to be for high-enrolling investigators in pivotal studies, new drug applications, pre-market applications, versus your for-cause inspections, which are going to be triggered by suspicious activities or complaints from a patient, the IRB, or your sponsor. Other activities, suspicious activities, could include conducting a large volume of clinical trials all at once, or there's a strong evidence of a significant financial interest in the study you're conducting. So during your inspection, you'll typically receive notification of an upcoming inspection about 5 to 10 business days prior to arrival. However, the agency can arrive unannounced. So your inspection officially begins upon receipt of the FDA Form 482, which is a notice of inspection. The inspector will hand that over at the very beginning, and you will both sign. And the inspector will review your specific records for data integrity and patient safety, compare source documents to CRFs, and to what was reported to the sponsor. In addition, they'll request copies of source documents for their personal files, which they'll use to build their case. Remember that the inspector should be escorted at all times and only provide precisely what has been requested, but be sure to provide everything that they request. The inspector may also ask clarifying questions or request further documentation for certain findings. When answering your questions, answer honestly and succinctly. Do not volunteer information or speculate. It's acceptable for you just to say you do not know, and you'll find out. And this happened to me a lot because I was not the original coordinator for the study, and I'd only been there for about a year. So I simply just stated, I don't know, but I will find out, and then I went and talked to the appropriate person. So be sure to be polite and respectful. Do not argue. That puts everybody in a bad mood if you're argumentative. And then each evening ask for a summary of the findings so far and request what will be on the agenda for the next day. And this allows you time to prepare the documents the day prior, make sure everything is on site, and then you also begin to anticipate where the investigator is taking their review. So another quick note for PIs, be respectful and conciliatory. Our PI did this, and I believe it set the tone for a successful and amicable inspection. Be sure to have working knowledge of the clinical trial protocol and the investigational product, along with your study subjects, and who on your staff was delegated to which tasks. Ultimately, the PI is responsible for all aspects of the study. You cannot say, that wasn't me, that was so-and-so. It just isn't acceptable, unfortunately. And that's ultimately because the PI signed the agreement stating he or she understands their responsibilities and accepts them as such. That's in the form of an investigator's agreement or a 1572. So once the inspection concludes, the inspector will hold an exit interview to discuss findings and deficiencies. So this requires, this will be issued, at this point, the FDA will issue their Form 483s, which is an inspectional observations. A written response should be made to those within 15 days after consulting with legal counsel. The response should address each specific finding and include a detailed plan for correcting those actions. Afterwards, the final report, known as the Establishment Inspection Report, is submitted to FDA headquarters by the field inspector, and the site will receive one of the three possible outcomes, which would be no action needed, meaning there was nothing objectionable found. Voluntary action is indicated, meaning that offensive conditions were found, but the FDA is not going to pursue action at that point. And then official action indicated would be something serious was found, it may have been false data or something along those lines, and then the FDA does plan to take official action. All right, so now that we have a little background on BIMO inspections, I wanted just to discuss the steps that I followed to get my research department audit ready, so to speak. So the steps are pretty simple, but I think that they're important. So the steps are as follows: evaluate your current studies and procedures, repair those issues identified, implement change using CAPAs and standard operating procedures to the identified issues, and create a plan for regulatory inspections. Maintain your operations and be vigilant afterwards. And then and while you're going through this process, I cannot encourage you enough to ask for help. I asked help from my CRAs, the IRB, and we even had to bring in consultants at certain points to help us get through this. Okay. So a little more in depth on the taking a step back and evaluating. So I want you to take a look at the larger picture and evaluate your clinical research program as a whole. Summarize your findings across all studies and then identify those commonalities. And while the primary goal is to fix the study you think is most likely to be audited, you will need to review and remedy all of your studies. And it may also be useful to call an enrollment hold at this point while you're correcting any of the issues. We paused enrollment and that helped us clean up our studies, and then we were able to move forward without having to focus on all of that back work. You may be thinking to yourself exactly what are you supposed to evaluate. So review regulatory and study subject files. Begin with that high-level view and work your way into the details. Review things like ICFs and ICF processes, making sure that there are no errors and that you have one available for all of your subjects. Ensure that all AEs are reported appropriately per your IRB and the protocol. And then make sure you have original source documentation present that backs up and validates the data that you've reported. Including that, I also recommend just taking a look at your monitoring visit letters. That's an easy, quick place to reach for that's going to compile your action items and your protocol deviations. And the inspector is going to do the exact same thing. That's the first place they're going to look because it does most of the work for them. And I make it a point during our monitoring visits to try to close out any actions on the front end so that we don't have any of that type of information documented. All right, so once the common issues are identified, it's time to address your problem areas. Clean and organize all your research records and space, and do so above board. You want to make sure that it's obvious that you were correcting issues. It would be very obvious if something has been changed to fit conveniently. And then make the necessary corrections utilizing GDP guidelines. A clear and electronic record should exist. And then make sure that your documentation is following ALCOA. Is it attributable? In other words, who is responsible? Legible? Can it be read? Contemporaneous? Was this recorded at the same time as the data was collected? Original? Was this the first place it was recorded? And accurate? Does it fit expectations? And one more quick note about good documentation practices, because this is always kind of a sore point. Making data corrections, make sure that you draw a single line through your incorrect entry, correct your data entry, add an explanation as to why you changed it, especially if it's not obvious, and then the person making the correction needs to initial and date, and never scribble out or use whiteout. And then back to your repairing of issues, you want to make sure that you fill in the gaps. So at this point, you're just looking for missing source documentation. Use emails or other documents if necessary, and you can use note to files. They're a way of explaining the unexplainable, but be very careful with note to files because sometimes they can highlight issues more than cover them up. And then remember, there's no reading between the lines. An auditor is not going to assume or infer anything. If it's not documented to them, it didn't happen. And then use the what if we all disappeared tomorrow mentality. You should document in a way that anybody can pick up your subject record. And it's twofold for you because you shouldn't be able to remember what happened to a subject 2 years ago. So you're documenting for both yourself and if everyone in your research team were to leave. All right, now that you've identified and corrected your immediate problem areas, it's time to implement your true change to prevent reoccurrence. So that would be in the process of making corrective and preventative actions, or CAPAs. They should be robust and directly address your identified issues. And then to do so, you should also be creating standard operating procedures. If they exist already, you should be reviewing them yearly and making sure that you're not deviating from your own policies, because you can actually be sanctioned for that. And then additionally, if you don't have them, create them. And you can just start small with just your problem areas. You don't need to create an intense portfolio of SOPs. So at this point, you should have a reviewed, cleaned study with new SOPs in place to prevent any further complications. We want to develop a strategic plan and a checklist now that can be activated upon impending inspection. So the checklist should document things like the space. You should have space for the details of the inspection, who's coming, what studies being inspected, and when and where. In the list of required notifications for use of facilities. So in other words, who needs to know that you're being audited? And then task assignments. In other words, who's in charge of what? Your escort, your scribe, who's making photocopies. And then workspace. Don't forget, you need special space that's isolated for your inspector, but you also need space for you to be able to talk and make your plans on how you're handling the current inspection. And then, although you've already done this once before, you should review all study documentation again. Each time you review, you're going to find something new. And then resolve any outstanding issues, new queries, or open action items, and then organize your regulatory files to make it easy to maneuver through for both you and the inspector. And then most importantly, do not change or alter data. In other words, do not falsify your records. All right, so after completing the previous 4 steps, all that remains is to maintain your order and your new processes. In theory, you should have a very clean and organized community of research. And then it's important to remain vigilant and continue to analyze your studies and procedures. New issues can arise, and new regulations may appear that require a new approach. And then most importantly, I think it's always important for us to remember why we work in clinical research. And that's because we, the sponsors, investigators, and regulatory agencies, all want the same thing, which is quality, honest data that protects and improves human lives. If we work together, the process can be smooth and nearly painless.